Good morning, my name is Liam with Guided Tours DC. Today we're going to make a tour through Capitol Hill on our Capitol Hill walking tour. We're going to start off by talking about the U.S. Supreme Court and then make our way into the U.S. Capitol building, where we'll have reserved access to the docent-led tour of the historic areas of the Capitol, including the Rotunda, the Crypt, and the Old House Chambers, also known as Statuary Hall. And then from the Capitol, we'll get a brief break and then make our way through the tunnels over to the Library of Congress, the largest library in the world and the largest collection of knowledge in the world. I'll be personally guiding you through the main halls of the Thomas Jefferson Building, the first of 3 buildings for the Library of Congress here in DC. The U.S. Supreme Court building. The Supreme Court originally did not have their own building. In fact, Article 1 of the Constitution is 2 pages long that describes Congress, the rules of Congress, what it takes to be an elected official in the House or the Senate. And Article 2 is about a page long. It defines the presidency. But Article 3, the court, is about this big, about a paragraph and a half long. So you don't have an age requirement. You don't even have a requirement for a law degree. And there's a good reason for that. The first law degree issued in the United States of America was in 1792 at William & Mary University, and the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1789. The only reason we have 9 justices today is coincidence. We originally had 5. Went up to 6 for a while, and then President Lincoln stacked the court during the Civil War up to 10. 1871, one of those passed away. We never replaced them. That's the only reason we have 9 today. In fact, the only thing that defines how a justice becomes a justice is Article 2 says the president appoints federal officers. Article 1 says the Senate approves them. So if the president appoints a new one and the Senate approves, we have 10. If one resigns or passes away and we don't replace them, then we have 8. Simple as that. The building we have today, this is because of William Howard Taft, the only president in history to be a Supreme Court justice, who was actually Chief Justice for the Supreme Court. For a while, they actually met in a pub right down the street where we started by the Library of Congress. And then Senate had a 3-story chamber, and they decided that was too big, so they built a floor up 1 level and let the Supreme Court borrow their old chambers temporarily, and they did for 161 years. Until William Howard Taft worked out a deal with Congress to get a budget to build their own building, and they moved out of the Capitol in 1935. Designed by architect Cass Gilbert, and he was given full authority on the design of the building, and you see a lot of his fingerprints in it. For instance, he designed the building to have a slogan up top, but they did not have a slogan at that time. So he put in a placeholder so they would know there's meant to be words here. That placeholder was equal justice under law. And the justice decided that's perfect, I love it, stick with it. And that became their slogan. Welcome to the Supreme Court building. This is the museum level located on the lower level. I'll be keeping my voice very low in here because it is a functioning office building. The Supreme Court justices have their offices surrounding us on each one of these levels. So here we have a model of the Supreme Court courtroom because it's not always open for the public to view. Whenever they're in argument currently, the courtroom is only open for those who line up to view the case. First come, first serve. People can line up out front to come in and actually view the argument. That's what the public gallery is for in the back. And so they have this here so people can see the court in case they can't make it up to see the courtroom above. The gold bar, that's where the term past the bar comes from. Anybody past the bar is a barred attorney. You can track that back to Williamsburg, Virginia, and the early courts in the United States of America back in the early colonies. And this is a statue of John Marshall. Again, we call him our first real Chief Justice because he's the one who made the court everything it is today. So first of all, the Supreme Court hears arguments from October to May, and then they start releasing opinions May, June, going into early July. And whenever they release the opinions, which is their final opinions, they release them right here at this window. And they'll have interns for the media who's outside will line up waiting for those 100, 200, 300 page documents. And they get it and they run out the door, out front, out to the street where you have somebody with a camera waiting to report, hand it over to them, and then that television personality or press person, they're waiting to get dialed in on the studio in one ear while reading that opinion ahead of them and getting ready to report. That's how quickly it runs. One opinion could be hundreds of pages long. Like for instance, Heller versus DC, the DC handgun case, first case in the Second Amendment in US history, that was Anthony Scalia's opinion. And the majority opinion alone was about 175 pages long. And so a lot of it is giving background information, talking about like like legal theory, philosophy, quoting Thomas Hobbes, Locke, the Blackstone commentaries, things like that to give a background. And so for in Heller versus DC, for instance, Antonin Scalia spent a lot of that opinion talking about defining individual words in the Constitution and how they were used in the 18th century in different laws in different states to show what the founders and the framers actually meant when they wrote those. And then in the end, brings it all down to one paragraph that essentially said, is therefore the opinion of the court you cannot outright ban the private possession of firearms, but you can regulate them. And so the District of Columbia is ordered to allow Heller the opportunity to apply for a permit to purchase a handgun. So this is the actual courtroom where every case has been heard since 1935, first Monday of October, 1935. As you can see, everything we saw in the model right here. So the justices often say, this is so intimate that if the attorney leans forward enough and holds out his hand far enough, then they can actually shake hands with the judge almost. It's that close. We have a tortoise holding up the lamps. That is an intentional sign of the slow pace of justice. It's a reference to the tortoise and the hare. See, looking across to the Capitol, and we have the Statue of Freedom on top of the Capitol. The Statue of Freedom is 19.5 feet tall, 15,000 pounds, and she faces east because sun never sets on the face of freedom. And to give you an idea of how much she indicates freedom for those who placed her, the men who started work on that dome in 1855 started work as enslaved men. Were emancipated April 17, 1862 here in DC, continued working as freedmen, as paid labor. It's a point of pride on this project, and placed her as freedmen in 1865. Now you can see the flag in the middle is flying right now. That flag is always up to remind us the Union still stands. There's been one flying ever since the Civil War when they built that dome. This area is dedicated to the memory of those who worked on this building who were enslaved. It is called Emancipation Hall. So all the statues in this area must be of men and women who never owned slaves. And you can see statues from here already. We'll see some of these more closely as we go downstairs. There are 2 statues allowed for each U.S. state, one for the District of Columbia. We fought for a while. Since we can't vote, can we at least have a statue? We have Frederick Douglass added back there in the back right. Now we're working on our second statue, so baby steps. And every state currently has 2 to my knowledge, except for Virginia. Virginia removed Robert E. Lee, and while they're waiting for his replacement. States have been going through removing their Confederate generals over the years. Florida was kind of ahead of the game before the Congress said no more Confederate generals. They removed one of their Confederate generals and replaced him with Mary McLeod Bethune. Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, educator, civil rights leader, and women's suffrage leader. And so she's going to be in Statuary Hall. You'll see her today, one of our newer statues. And we have 3 primary areas on the tour in the Capitol for the publicly available tours. That's going to be the Rotunda, which is what's holding up the dome, which is deceptively large. You could stand the Statue of Liberty in the Rotunda and she would not touch the ceiling by 10 feet. We have the Crypt, which is what's holding up the Rotunda, was originally built for George Washington. A little bit of spoiler on this. George Washington's not buried there. He refused to be idolized and buried in the District of Columbia, so he's buried at Mount Vernon in his home. And the other area you'll see is Statuary Hall, which is the original House chambers. And when they moved from that to the new House chambers, they tried to figure out what to do with the old House chambers, and eventually decided to put statues on display, and that's what started the statue collection. Statuary halls where we showcase some of our newer or more prominent statues, or some of those states that you didn't see in other areas, so every state can at least see one of their statues. And the Crypt is the 13 original states, sans Virginia right now. They could have moved their other statue down there, but they would not because their other statue is George Washington. And he is in the Rotunda, because the Rotunda is where we have presidents. So you want to keep Washington right there. If you see, even on our photos and on the requirements for these statues, they have to be dead, made out of marble or bronze. And since Hawaii put in King Kamehameha at 9 tons, there's now a weight restriction of 5 tons, because that one was actually breaking the floor. So Kamehameha is at a column to help hold his weight, but also he's under a skylight so nobody will ever walk over his head because he's a deity to Native Polynesians. John Swigert from Colorado, from Apollo 13. Unfortunately, he was on a mission to the moon and never made it to the moon, no fault of his own, because it was Apollo 13. Also on a mission to Congress and never made it to Congress, no fault of his own. He was elected, as you can see, Congressman-elect, but he died before he served a single day in office. And here we have Helen Keller, one of the two statues for Alabama. The other one is actually a Confederate general who was reinstated in the U.S. Army during the Spanish-American War, Joseph Wheeler. Joseph Wheeler took his commitment to Union and Army seriously, so much so he attended a Confederate Veterans Reunion wearing his Army dress blues instead of his Confederate grays. And one of his colleagues said, "If Jackson can see you now, he'd be rolling over in his grave." And he responded, "I'm most likely to see him in hell soon. He can tell me himself if he still has the guts." And is buried in Arlington Cemetery in his Army dress blues at his request. Helen Keller is also buried in this region. She's buried at the National Cathedral in Northwest DC, the last Gothic cathedral constructed in the history of the world, which is a wonderful place to visit. I highly recommend. She's buried in the central chapel of the lower crypts, marked in Braille, as is her good friend and the miracle worker herself, Annie Sullivan, the first woman to be interred in the National Cathedral in history. Now, I mentioned the state statues. We also have statues that are put in by Congress to honor certain people in history, like Sojourner Truth right over here, who actually lived at Arlington for a while when they built the Freedmen's Village on the property during the Civil War. She worked there as a teacher, a preacher, and an advocate for those who were living on the property. This is the original model for the statue on top of the Capitol, the Statue of Freedom. This is not a replica. This is the original they made the cast off of to form the one on top of the building. It's one of 3 models sent to us from Italy, from an American-born artist living abroad. And up top, she's wearing a freedom cap with 13 stars for the 13 original colonies, and a sword of justice and a U.S. shield on the other side. She's also holding an olive wreath. This goes back to Roman times, where Caesars would come back from war wearing an olive wreath, showing that they had victory and triumph, and therefore peace, ideally. So we're taking a tunnel over to the Library of Congress now. This tunnel was built in 2008 to connect the Library of Congress to the U.S. Capitol building. It's a great way to go back and forth between the two buildings without having to step outside. And as we enter the first phrase we come under, appropriately enough, right above you, is knowledge is power. And so the U.S. Capitol, the center of our elected government, is connected to the center of knowledge. Intentionally, knowledge is power. So welcome to the Library of Congress, Thomas Jefferson Building, and to explain the history here a bit, the Library of Congress was authorized by John Adams in 1800 for the first library, and that was inside the Capitol in 1814 when the British and Canadian forces burned down the entire city, including the Capitol, during the War of 1812. And Thomas Jefferson sold his personal collection of near 6,500 books to Congress for about $24,000 to replace that original library. So when they moved out in 1897 to this building, they named it after Thomas Jefferson in his honor. This building was constructed over a 10-year period, 1887 to 1897, had 40 different artists working on it at one time to construct this building. Today, there are 3 primary buildings here in DC for the Library of Congress: Jefferson Building, Adams Building, and Madison Building, all 3 connected via tunnels underground. And here in this area, we have tile mosaics with 10 disciplines of knowledge above us, or study, and surrounded by American-born leaders in these subjects in this particular area. So for instance, we have law with John Marshall, we talked about earlier, on one side, our 4th Chief Justice. We have Taney next to that, who's our 5th Chief Justice. He was the one who ruled against the Indian Removal Act with Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson famously said, "Taney has made his decision, now watch him try to enforce it," and completely ignored the court. Before they moved out to the Madison Building across the street, the original head librarian's office was located right here. Now it's primarily used for ceremonies. Our current head librarian is Carla Hayden, first woman, first person of color to have that position in history, appointed by President Barack Obama. It was originally a term for life, or until they decided to retire. It is now a 10-year term, so she'll be coming up on hers in about 3 years. The appropriately named Great Hall. This is the original entryway for the building here. In fact, pre-COVID, this is where you would enter as a visitor. If you're doing research, you'd enter on the ground floor. But they have moved that downstairs. And there's a lot going on in this room. So start at our feet, kind of work our way up. We have Indiana marble at our feet. We have the zodiacs surrounding the sun on the compass in the center. Coming up from that, we have Italian marble throughout this building. This building is only a $46 million budget when they built it, which is about $3.8 billion today. We did Italian marble, an Italian Renaissance-inspired design. So to inspire those who do research here, that when you're seeking to pursue and expand upon knowledge, that you are inspired by those from the Renaissance, the great masters, Old World and New World, actually. We have Thomas Jefferson, the father of this library, on one side, and George Washington, the father of our nation, on the other. We have the lady holding the torch, that is study, lighting the way. We have Minerva behind me, holding up the ceiling. One with a torch and a sword, Minerva at wartime. The other unarmed with the sphere of knowledge, Minerva at peacetime. The idea being wisdom during wartime, wisdom during peacetime. And this building is America showing off its greatest architects, its greatest artists, its greatest minds. The quotes on these walls were chosen by the head librarian of the Library of Congress and the president of Harvard University at the time. But it's also showing off our wealth from one of the early Gilded Ages. Everything that looks like gold is real gold. Everything above you that looks like silver is actually aluminum, because that was the rarest and most expensive metal on Earth at the time before we learned how to smelt it from raw. There's a lot going on here. First of all, we have these quotes from great writers in history, again, chosen by the head librarian and the president of Harvard University, the leaders of knowledge in the nation at the time. And these are surrounded by lamps representing knowledge. Who are some of these authors? Well, we have William Shakespeare, the Bible, Sir Francis Bacon, for instance, Carlyle, Emerson, Socrates. Above that, we have 4 painted figures on each side by the same artist. It kind of shows the duality of nature. You have the humanities and you have nature. So on this side, we have elements of study, to read, to write, to teach, and to ponder. On the other side, we have the 4 seasons of the year. Now, the Library of Congress has kind of gone through 3 phases in life. It was originally the research library for the Capitol, hence Library of Congress. So they do their law, philosophy, studies, history, and then they became America's libraries. They moved over here and opened up to the nation. And today they consider themselves the world's library. As in order to do research here, you have to be over the age of 16, have an ID, fill out a form, get your reader's card. That simple, it takes about 5 minutes. So people come from around the world to do research here at the Library of Congress. And what does a library contain? Pretty much everything. So there's almost 200 million books in the collection today, over 350 million items in the collection, including, well, thanks to Lizzo, we all know this is the largest flute collection in the nation today. We have musical instruments. We have Rachmaninoff's personal piano, donated here by his granddaughter and two of his great-grandsons who live here in DC. It's in this building. We have maps, manuscripts, photography, artwork, literature, because not all knowledge is passed down through books, but also because federal copyrights go through the Library of Congress ever since 1871. And so all copyright registrations go through the Library of Congress. One of the most famous photos in American history. And one of the reasons that the books and documentaries on the Great Depression have the greatest photography is because Franklin Delano Roosevelt hired photographers to document the effects of the Great Depression. Because first of all, those people needed jobs, and nobody was going to hire a photographer when you couldn't even get a job making food at the time. Like, it was rough. And that's why these belong to the American people. You can actually contact the Library of Congress and request this print, and you can get a print of it. So, recap a little bit. Thomas Jefferson sold his original collection, about 6,500 books, to Congress in 1815 to replace those lost in the War of 1812 and 1814. That's why we don't name wars from start years, by the way. And 1851, we had a fire inside the reading room where somebody spilled their lamp. So they banned well oil in the Capitol at that point, but we lost about 2/3 of this collection, about 4,000 books. When they built this building, to make sure that we never have a fire in this building, it was wired with electric lighting by Thomas Alva Edison. It was wired, it had pneumatic electric elevators first built into a building during construction in the history of the United States of America, and was plumbed with gas to make sure there'd be no open flames, no chance for fire here. It's also not much wood in this building for that same reason. These are original Edison light fixtures throughout this building, by the way. They try to preserve the original fixtures as much as possible throughout the building. 487 books Thomas Jefferson sold to Congress for about $24,000, and represented in 4 ways. First of all, we have the white spines. These are boxes representing books that are currently missing from the collection. We do have the original invoice, so we know what there was there. We have ones that have no ribbons, but they have a white tag on the back. That's the Library of Congress identification tag. That's where we had another copy, but it's not Thomas Jefferson's original copy per se. We have some that have gold ribbons, like you see right back here. These are ones where we bought a copy to replace one of Thomas Jefferson's original copies. But the green ribbons are Thomas Jefferson's original books. He held them, he read them in all 9 of their native languages, and many have his original notes inside, and every one has a letter T next to the letter I on page I for Thomas Jefferson, because back then I and J were the same letter in type. Perhaps 4 of the most important books in this entire building. These are Thomas Jefferson's original copies of the Blackstone Commentaries, which you heard me mention earlier, ever so briefly, when we were talking about opinions at the Supreme Court. That's because this is the foundation of our legal system in the United States of America. Trial by jury, an adversarial legal system, and English common law, and other pillars of our legal system came from these exact books. And when I say these exact books, because you can trace it back to Thomas Jefferson and the Continental Congress, before that in the Virginia Charters, and before that Thomas Jefferson reading these exact copies. Blackstone, unlike a lot of philosophers, wrote everything in English, by the way, so it could be approachable by the common person, much like you would have Thomas Paine, for instance. It was not meant to appeal to other academics or philosophers. It was meant to appeal to the average person and change the history of the world, which in theory it did. It's referenced by a good portion of court cases to this day. The elements up top, this one references the explorers of the early Americas from England, Portugal, France, and Spain. And the other rooms, it would actually have different Greek, Roman, and other gods throughout history from different elements, earth, wind, fire. about to see the main reading room. There are 26 reading rooms across these 3 buildings, and a lot of those are broken down by different subjects because of the reference material that goes with it. So for instance, the Asian reading room will have the largest collection of Asian literature outside of Asia, but it'll also have like dictionaries, encyclopedias, and atlases that will help you understand what you're reading. Because when you request an item here, it may take 45 minutes up to 3 hours to get it to the reading room if it's on site. If it's off-site in our storage facilities in Maryland or Virginia, depending on books or audiovisual, it may take up to 3 days. So you do have to plan ahead sometimes. So when you request an item through their online portal, they'll email you when it's ready. So sometimes you can request an item here and then go to the food court across the street, hang out, work where you have access to coffee, use their digital resources. When you get your email, pack up, check your bag in, because you can't take bags in the reading room, so go to the reading room, it's ready for you. When you get an item at one of the reading rooms, they can hold it. So if you're not finished in 1 day, you tell the librarian, please hold. They'll hold it up to 3 days, and you can keep doing that. And so you can keep coming back for months and months using that item. And this reading room, the main reading room, this is the humanities room, is what they refer to it as well. And this is where most people start their day. This is the largest of all the reading rooms. It has 224 reading desks, first come, first serve, plus reading nooks around the side you can use. A lot of reference material in here. There's even hard data. There's a room in here that is specifically phone books throughout history.